So, before I jump into the evidence for how science has demonstrated evolution to be true, I want to talk about what is science and what exactly is the theory of evolution, because before we dig in, we should probably know that, and I'll be on the same page. So, science can be defined as humankind's collective, ongoing, systematic attempt to accurately describe reality. It's collective because everybody can participate. It's ongoing because we've really only just begun to scratch the surface. There are many aspects of reality which haven't yet been described. And science is systematic because there are rules in science. And the main thing that separates science from other fields of inquiry, like philosophy or religion, is that in science, when we're doing science, the observable universe is the only valid authority when we're doing science. So we have famous scientists like Professor Richard Dawkins or Stephen Jay Gould, pictured here, and they've contributed wonderful things to the field of biology, but they are not authorities in science. There is no pope of science. If any person or group or holy book makes a claim about reality, that claim cannot be considered scientifically valid unless it is backed up by observable evidence in the real world. Now, a scientist can be thought of as a puzzle builder, and in this analogy, this puzzle piece here represents a scientific fact, an observable scientific fact. This here in my hand is an observable scientific fact. This is a fossil. And we might not all agree in this room that this is in fact a fossil. Some people might think it's just a silly looking rock or something like that, but all of us agree that this object exists, and we can observe it with our senses. Another example of an observable fact would be a repeatable experiment. If you take water and you heat it up at sea level, it's going to boil at 100 degrees Celsius every time. That's another example of an observable fact. A scientist's job is to collect as many facts as they can, and once they've collected those facts, they arrange them into a comprehensive picture. This, in science, is what we call scientific theory. Theories are made up of facts, and that makes them actually better than facts because a single fact alone, a single puzzle piece alone, doesn't tell us that much about the world. But when we put them together, at a glance, we can see how the world works. And so a good theory, it makes sense all the way through. Like this picture here, we can see that it makes sense. We're starting to see what it's trying to show us. But there are missing puzzle pieces in this theory that I'm showing you here. But that's okay because the second thing that a good theory does is it grows. A good theory helps us draw hypotheses. And a hypothesis is an educated guess about what those missing puzzle pieces might look like. When we know what they might look like, we can go out into the real world, we can find them, and we can add them to our puzzle. In Darwin's time, people were collecting lots of facts about biology that nobody had been able to arrange them into a comprehensive theory. And one of the reasons for that was because in Darwin's time, it was socially acceptable for scientists to mix their religion in with the science that they were doing. And so what people were doing is they would collect all these facts, doing a good job at that, but instead of arranging them, trying to figure out how they fit together, they were just doing this. They were just trying to tie everything back up to their particular version of God. This is bad science for many reasons, but one of which is that different people, of course, believe in different gods. And so there's a lot of confusion when people start doing this. If you were to ask a biologist in Darwin's time, why is it that whales breathe air, have finger, hand, and wrist bones inside their flippers, and give milk to their young? A scientist in Darwin's time probably would have just told you, that's just how God made it. I don't know. And that's the best they could do because they hadn't come up with a theory. Darwin took all the facts that people had collected, and he arranged them into a theory, the theory of evolution by natural selection. And this is what that theory looks like today. It wasn't this well built in Darwin's time. It was very much dependent on hypotheses, some of which have been proven false, but the core of what Darwin gave us has been demonstrated by science to be true. The theory of evolution is founded on three main pillars. Depending on how you look at it, but descent with modification, natural selection, and speciation. This here is Hercules, the Caribbean marine hermit crab, and he's going to guide us through those pillars. These are his cousins that I found at the Oregon coast recently. Descent with modification is simply when parents have children, those children often look and behave slightly different than their parents and slightly different than each other. Hermit crabs, for example, there's a hermit crab here on the right, next to one of his distant cousins on the left. Hermit crabs are actually a type of lobster, they're not really crabs. But hermit crabs all vary in pincher size, they vary in the shape of their tail, and the little tails there that you're seeing are what they fit inside the seashells so they can protect themselves when they're running around on the beach and in the ocean. Here's a closer view of that. But there are many things that cause variations between individuals, one of which is genetic mutations. And a gene is a tiny piece of DNA. It's a stretch of DNA that codes for something. We have thousands of genes in our body, and together these tell our bodies how to grow and function. When we reproduce, we make a copy of our genes, and we pass that copy on to our children. And this gene here, which was just copied, has a genetic mutation in it. It has a spontaneous variation popped up in this gene as it was being copied. And that's what causes differences. That's one of the things that causes differences between individuals. A study in 2011 found that each person studied was born with an average of 42 unique mutations in their genes. So mutations are very common. All of us have them. If mutations are severe, you will die before you're even born. Roughly 70 to 75% of all pregnancies fail before the mother even knows that she's pregnant in humans. Most of these are due to genetic mutations. If mutations are mild, you will often survive birth, but you might be born with slightly unique features. This can be bad or this can be good, and that's what brings us to natural selection. We live in a very dangerous world. Genetic mutations, among other things, produce individuals with many unique traits. Some new traits will allow a creature to survive better than its parents survived. Some new traits will make it harder to survive. If you're a hermit crab, for example, your tail needs to fit snugly into the shells that are commonly found in your environment. Once you find the perfect shell, you need to be able to hold on for dear life. If a mutation makes this difficult for you, you're likely to get eaten, you're going to die before you have kids, and that mutation that made it difficult for you is going to die with you. It'll be forever erased from the face of the earth. If a mutation makes your tail extra strong, you're going to be better at surviving than your parents were. You're far more likely to survive and have children than your siblings are, and when you do have children, many of them will inherit your wonderful new tail. Through this, nature, simply by being difficult to survive in, selects who gets to survive and pass their genes on, and who has to die young. Over time, a population will become more and more fit for survival and reproduction within its specific environment, and that's really important. Different environments select for different traits, and that's what powers speciation. There are 8.7 million species, an estimated 8.7 million species of plants and animals in eukaryotes on Earth today. Speciation is the idea that through the process of evolution, one species can become two species. So how does this happen? Hermit crabs are a wonderful example of this. There are over 1,000 species of hermit crabs. Most hermit crabs, like this one here, live on the ocean floor. They eat plants and they eat dead animals, and they breathe water through their gills. They don't breathe air, they breathe water. And if they leave the water for too long, they will suffocate. Some hermit crabs have left the seafloor to live in tide pools. And tide pools are wonderful places to live in because the waves will bring food to you. Unfortunately, it's also dangerous because the tide can leave you dry and stranded. The waves can knock you out of the tide pool. There's all sorts of things that can happen. And if you have gills that only breathe water, you're going to suffocate. Descent with modification, however, has produced gills in some hermit crabs which can pull oxygen directly from the air, not as well as they do in the water, but good enough to survive at least a little bit longer on land. Natural selection has favored these gills for hermit crabs who live in tide pools. This is an example of one of these mutated hermit crabs that survives in a tide pool and can live for hours, almost several days on land. They've been recorded to live several days on land with no water to hydrate them. Hercules, the land hermit crab, is so well adapted for life out of water that he no longer needs to go underwater at all in order to breathe. In fact, he's so well evolved for life on land that if he falls into the ocean and doesn't get out in time, he will drown. Evolution has pulled him away from his ancestors so far that he can't even visit them if he wants to. As you can see from this diagram of the theory of evolution. There are holes in the theory. There are parts that we don't yet understand. But the overall picture is crystal clear. And that picture is that all life on Earth shares a common ancestor. When I get back up here, I will show you how we know that. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Let me reset my timer and then we'll have a break. Come on. All right. Well, I want to just forewarn you that some of what I'm going to be presenting to you are the words of other people than myself. And I'm going to be quoting people. I don't know if you've ever heard the expression quote mining. It's a term made up by evolutionists to describe people who are not evolutionists and who debate evolutionists, like me. Quote mining, they say, is taking an authority's words out of context to misrepresent what they believe. Creationists, it is said, do this all the time because we quote evolutionists continuously against their own position. And I will do some of that myself. Is that quote mining? Most people would call that documentation. If it was not debating against evolutionists, no one would call it quote mining. They call it documenting your case. The truth is, I will not quote anybody out of context. But when you write a research paper, you quote from large bodies, you take out a sentence or two. You omit the context. But you're doing nothing dishonest unless you're misrepresenting the meaning of the statement in its context. And so be careful when people say that creationists quote mine. I wouldn't be surprised. John has told me on the air before, he's told me I do that. I've never quote mined in my life. Now, he quoted the Pope, and he quoted a Mormon authority. That wasn't quote mining because it wasn't against evolution. It was favorable to evolution. If you quote an evolutionist against evolution, you're quote mining, supposedly. But the truth of the matter is that evolution has a lot more holes in it than that picture of the tree would indicate. You have almost a complete picture of a tree there with a few little pieces missing. No question what the whole picture looks like. Most scientists are willing to admit, when they're not being not planning to be quoted, that the picture is much more spotty than that. There's far more missing pieces than was indicated in that picture. And many will even say evolution really isn't in the realm of science at all because it's never been observed. And this means we have to actually define what science is. Now, John gave a definition that included, as its main point for defining science, it's a systematic endeavor to accurately describe reality. Now, do you realize that reality there is being reduced to such things as science can describe? What can science describe? Only things that can be observed in the natural realm. So, by this definition, only the natural realm is reality. God isn't reality. Souls are not reality. Love is not reality because that can't be described scientifically. There's many things that are not in reality to the evolutionist, if that's his definition of science. The natural world is indeed what science is restricted to studying. But it's not what reality is restricted to necessarily. At least that's a separate point that needs to be discussed. And it is a philosophical point. You see, when we say evolution is science, we're not really defining science in a true sense. Science is empirical, verifiable knowledge about things in the natural world. John showed you a fossil. He said some people might dispute that that's a fossil. I'm not sure who would dispute it. Can't imagine why anyone would want to dispute it. There are plenty of fossils out there, and that was probably one. I didn't get a good look at it. He said fossils, observable things like that, that can be one thing that science studies. Also empirical tests, testable experiments. That definitely is well within the realm of science. But nobody has observed the main claims of evolution ever occurring, nor have they been able to prove that they can occur or have occurred. What do I mean by that? I think I better define evolution. Evolution, as we are discussing it, I believe, where John and I would differ, is the grand claim that all living things came from a common ancestor through a process of random mutation and natural selection primarily. Darwin said there were some things besides natural selection that may have played a role. And in his other second great book, The Descent of Man, he indicated that sexual selection, which is something different than natural selection, may have played a bigger role. But the truth is that all evolutionists today, for the most part, at least the ones who follow Dawkins' line, which is the mainstream evolution, they believe that everything came about through natural selection pretty much, very gradually. Stephen Jay Gould was mentioned as an authority in science too. He's, of course, died back 2001, I think. And he and Dawkins were at each other's throats about different ideas, about what they think was the story of evolution. People have glossed over that now that Gould's gone. People have said, well, Gould's theory fits kind of into slow and gradual evolution too. It's just once in a while it's punctuated. The truth of the matter is that Dawkins and Gould didn't think they were on the same page. Dawkins and Gould were against each other. Dawkins is highly critical of Gould. Now, these guys are both leading scientists. In fact, some have described them as the two leading evolutionary scientists of the past generation, or of the present generation. I think since Dawkins is about 70 years old, he's of the past generation. And so am I, by the way. But the point here, the two leading evolutionary scientists of the generation can't agree about the main process of evolution. They are the most knowledgeable men, or at least among the most knowledgeable men on the subject. Now, if they can't agree how evolution occurred, then I think it must be clear that science is not demonstrating how evolution occurred. Because if it had, they both would have known about it. They would have disagreed. The truth is, no one has seen any real evolution occur. Unless we're going to scale down the word evolution to mean variation. Now, what does variation mean? Well, John described it. Hermit crabs and other creatures, they have a gene pool that allows for mutation, allows for variation, and sometimes that variation can become very extreme. More well known to us than the hermit crab is the Canis familiaris, the dog. There are 200 breeds of dogs, and you can imagine the wide range of body styles, hair colors and distribution, size, and so forth that are all the same species. You can see that within a single species, most species are not as variable as dogs are, but the dogs are a good example of how, in many cases, one species has a sufficient gene pool that mutations can produce a wide variety of creatures. If we didn't have modern dogs and simply found all 200 breeds in the fossil record, we wouldn't know they were the same species. We know they are because they can interbreed, and we have living ones to do that with. But you wouldn't be able to tell that from the fossil record. Now, animals can vary. But breeding of animals has been going on for thousands of years. That's why there's so many different kinds of dogs. People have been breeding them for thousands of years. They have found a limit. Dogs don't become as big as elephants. They become as big as borzois, but they don't become as big as elephants. This is not just because we haven't had enough time to breed dogs as big as elephants. Breeders have found there are limits to the range of change. Now, the limits within the dog species are quite broad. Within other species, sometimes not so broad. And sometimes the change can even result in what is technically a new species. Because we define species usually simply as two different groups of animals that cannot interbreed with each other and produce viable offspring, fertile offspring. And therefore, there might be a group of field mice who, because they're separated from their ancestral population, they go through certain mutations so they can't interbreed with the ancestral population anymore. Technically, we call them another species. But if you look at them, they're still field mice. They look exactly like each other. To be a different species doesn't mean that you've changed very much in terms of your body or your lifestyle, or that you've adapted to a new environment. It might be, but not always. The point is that we have observed variation. Everybody knows that. There's never been a creationist on the planet who doesn't acknowledge that. When people say that's evolution, they're being disingenuous. That's not evolution. That's just variation. Now, evolutionists claim that a single-celled creature became a multicellular creature. Not only has no one ever observed that, no one can even present a scientific theory of how that could happen. You might say, well, it's easy. Every one of us began as a single cell in our mother's womb. We became multicellular. What's so magical? What's so difficult about that? The reason you became a human being is because that single cell in your mother's womb had human DNA. And human DNA is information. It's information that tells the cell how to differentiate into various proteins, different cells, so that one single cell Branches off, and some of its descendants become muscle cells, some blood cells, some bone cells, some brain cells, some nerve cells, some hair cells. That's because the DNA in a human zygote will code for all that different kind of thing. Now, if you start out with a single-cell creature, an amoeba, let us say, or paramecium, they have complete DNA for their species. They don't have human DNA. They don't even have frog DNA. They don't even have jellyfish DNA. They only have amoeba DNA or paramecium DNA. And you know what? An amoeba and a paramecium are capable of existing without any additional cells. They're one-celled creatures. Suppose an amoeba started to move or wanted to move, or we wanted it to move in the direction of being a multicellular creature. What's it take? Well, you're going to have two amoebas, then 4, then 8, and they're going to have to stick together. These would not be a multicellular creature. These would be Siamese twins. Because each amoeba is a fully functional, independent organism. They just have to be glued together somehow. You will not create a multicellular creature that way. You need information in the DNA that will code for different kinds of cells from that creature. No one has ever even suggested a possible way in which that can happen. Science, that's a huge step science needs to take if they're to prove evolution. They have not proven it, nor can they even prove that it's plausible or a possibility. John, I think, didn't want to talk about the origin of life in this debate, so we won't. The reason for not talking about it is because the origin of life has nothing to do with evolution in one sense. Because evolution requires living things to mutate. And then natural selection can play a role on them. And non-living things don't mutate. But that also means that non-living things don't organize themselves into proteins and cells, which does have some impact on the idea of evolution, because evolutionists don't believe it's only the biological system. They believe that all of reality started with just random particles and things organized eventually into proteins, then into cells, and then cells that were alive changed into creatures eventually, gave rise to creatures that were multicellular. Among those, they were all invertebrates. The Cambrian explosion, which is the earliest fossil-bearing rock that has any kind of significant multicellular creatures in it, shows just about every phylum in the world of creatures that are invertebrates. Now, you and I are vertebrates. That means you have a backbone. Some of you may not be vertebrates, but in all likelihood, we all have backbones and internal skeletons. The earliest animals, as they are so-called, that supposedly arose from a single cell, were invertebrates. They had no internal skeleton. There are things like trilobites, hermit crabs, centipedes. Today we have insects. They came along later according to evolution, but we have all kinds of animals that don't need skeletons inside. Somehow, though, with thousands or millions of different species of invertebrates, somehow creatures that needed internal skeletons arose, and no one can say how or why. These are huge missing pieces in the puzzle. The gap from single cell to multicellular, from invertebrate to vertebrate, and then to major animal groups. They have not been filled by evidence. What evolution does is extrapolates from variation, which can be observed and nobody denies, to the postulate that variation can be so far removed over a period of millions of years that something entirely different comes up. Not just a different kind of field mouse that can't interbreed with its ancestral field mice, but a bat from a field mouse, a whale from a weasel, a horse from a dog-like ancestor, a man from an ape-like ancestor. These things have never been demonstrated. Now, I would assume that John's going to show us some fossils of transitional forms between these creatures. I'm aware of those. If he does, I'll have something to say about it. If he doesn't, I won't bother. The truth of the matter is, even if he can show a few fossils of transitional creatures, transitional is a philosophically charged word. It suggests that there's a transition taking place. It's better to call them intermediate because they have features of one kind of animal and features of another kind. Whether they were in the process of evolving from one kind to another is a philosophical question because no one knows. And there aren't enough intermediates to make a complete phylogeny of creatures evolving. And there's no reason to doubt that these were mosaic creatures that didn't fit neatly into any one group. He showed a picture of Archaeopteryx, a reptile-like bird, or is it a bird-like reptile? It's got features of both. So they say, well, it's transitional. I don't think there's any living evolutionist who would say that Archaeopteryx is an ancestor of modern birds, but they say it's sort of transitional between the two groups. But we have living animals today, the monotremes, that are intermediate. They're not transitional between anything. They're just a different kind of animal. I've run over time, so I'm going to let Jon speak some more.